The Constitution of Medina. The Constitution of Medina, also called the Mithaq al-Madinah. I explain its historical background, the parties involved, and then go through its major articles/themes one by one with detailed commentary on what each point meant in practice and why it mattered. This is written to be informative and self-contained. 1. Overview: what the Constitution of Medina was. The Constitution of Medina was a written agreement formulated shortly after the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, migration, hijra, from Mecca to Yathrib, which later became known as Medina. Its primary function was to organize political, social, and legal relations among the diverse residents of Medina, Muslim immigrants from Mecca, the Muhajirun, the Medinan supporters, Ansar, and a number of Jewish and other non-Muslim tribal groups. The document established the framework of a pluralistic polity, a single political community, an ummah, with shared responsibilities for collective security, dispute resolution, and mutual obligations, while recognizing different religious identities and community autonomy. 2. Historical and social background. Pre-Hijra situation, Yathrib, Medina, was a multi-tribal oasis city. Local society was organized along tribal lines, e.g., Aws and Khazraj, and included Jewish tribes such as Banu Kinuka, Banu Nadir, and Banu Qurayza. Before the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, arrival, inter-tribal rivalry, vendettas, and cycles of retaliation had weakened civic order. Reason for the contract: when the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, and his followers migrated, they were invited as a neutral and respected leader to help rebuild political order. The Constitution served to transform the city from a loosely allied set of tribes into a federated community with rules to reduce conflict and ensure mutual defense. Form and transmission. The agreement is often described in early Islamic sources as a set of clauses or articles agreed by representatives. It is preserved in various early Muslim histories and legal texts. Scholars emphasize its role as a practical political document rather than an abstract theological manifesto. 3. Parties to the agreement. Muhajirun, immigrants, early Muslims who left Mecca and settled in Medina. Ansar, helpers, two major Arab tribes of Medina, Aws and Khazraj, and their sub-tribes who welcomed and supported the immigrants. Jewish tribes and others. Several Jewish clans and some non-Arab groups retained distinct communal rights, but also entered into the political covenant. The Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, served as the primary signatory and the central authority for dispute resolution and enforcement of the Charter's terms. 4. Foundational principle: single political community with plural identities. Unity of the polity. Ummah. The Constitution articulated that for political purposes, the signatories constituted a single community. This meant that while religious identity could differ, the groups united under common civic obligations. Implication: this created the basis for a sovereign political entity whose members owed each other security and mutual support. The notion was not erasing distinct identities, but coordinating them under a common civic umbrella. 5. Mutual defense and collective security. Collective responsibility. One of the clearest provisions required the signatories to defend Medina as one unit. An attack on one party was effectively an attack on all. Practical effect: the clause curtailed internecine vendettas and created an obligation to contribute to the common defense. Men could be mobilized, supplies shared, and strategic decisions coordinated. Deterrent and stabilizer. By making tribes accountable to the whole community, the Constitution deterred acts of aggression and made the city a less attractive target for outside forces. 6. Protection of life, property, and honor. Security guarantees. The Charter protected individuals' lives, property, and honor, regardless of tribal affiliation, so long as they remained within the umbrella of the agreement. Why it mattered: pre-Islamic Arabia experienced blood feuds and cycles of revenge. Guaranteeing basic protections reduced vendettas and allowed commerce and daily life to function with greater predictability. Enforcement mechanism. The Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, was designated as the primary arbiter to resolve disputes and enforce penalties when parties violated these protections. 7. Autonomy of religious communities and freedom of worship. Religious autonomy. The Constitution recognized the right of different religious communities, notably Jewish tribes, to maintain their own religion, laws, and internal affairs. Practical arrangements. Jews retained their religious courts for matters among themselves and were not forced into the Muslim community's ritual life. Balance achieved. This was a form of early pluralism. Political allegiance and security obligations were shared, but religious self-governance was preserved. 8. Shared judiciary and dispute resolution. Central role of arbitration. When disputes cross community lines or threaten the polity's peace, the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, and his appointed mechanisms would mediate and adjudicate. Law and practice. Internal community disputes could often be handled internally. When they implicated others or endangered the general order, the central authority intervened. Legal pluralism. The charter allowed for different legal rules inside communities while providing a public forum for conflicts affecting the whole city. 9. Rules about alliances, neutrality, and external relations. Regulation of treaties. The document set rules about making alliances with outside tribes and nations. Decisions that affected the whole community had to be coordinated, not made unilaterally by individuals or sub-tribes. Collective diplomacy. This prevented factions from dragging the city into potentially ruinous external conflicts and ensured unified foreign policy decisions. Tributary and treaty relations. The Constitution provided a diplomatic identity for Medina as a single actor in relations with other tribal confederations and polities. 10. Economic obligations and mutual support. Shared economic responsibilities. While not a detailed economic code, the charter implied mutual support during crises, including sharing of resources for defense and for refugees. Protection of trade. By guaranteeing safety and property, it indirectly fostered trade and economic stability. Merchants could operate with greater confidence. Charitable and communal obligations. Social practices such as aiding the needy and assisting those harmed by conflict were part of the general ethic reinforced by the covenant. 11. Responsibilities in wartime. Who fights and who pays? Military participation. Those within the pact were expected to contribute manpower to collective defense when required. Financial contributions. The contract anticipated shared costs of war and defense. Communities would bear their share of material burden rather than leaving it to a single party. Distinction for noncombatants. Some communities maintained the right to noncombatant status, e.g., certain allied groups, but they still had obligations to the political entity, for example, to aid with supplies or to remain neutral in conflicts that would harm Medina. 12. Limits on vendettas and blood feuds. Substitution of state justice. The Constitution curtailed the pre-Islamic practice of private revenge by channeling grievances into communal arbitration and adjudication. Social consequence. This greatly reduced cycles of retaliatory violence, which have been a major cause of instability in tribal Arabia, and allowed a civic legal order to emerge. 13. Equality before the political community, not necessarily social or religious equality. Political equality. In the political sense, signatories shared duties and protections. The contract placed all tribes under the same civic obligations. Distinct statuses preserved. The charter did not erase social hierarchies or religious distinctions. Jews, Arabs, and Muslims kept different internal norms and rights, but when acting in matters of the polity, all were subject to shared rules. Implication. It was a pragmatic unity designed for governance and survival, rather than an ideological leveling of all social differences. 14. Role of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, as head of state and judge. Final arbiter. The Constitution vested ultimate authority in the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, as the chief political and judicial figure, whose decisions resolved disputes and interpreted the pact. Not absolute monarchy. His leadership combined spiritual, legislative, administrative, and judicial functions, but was exercised in the context of communal consultation and consent. Historically, the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, sought to implement the covenant's spirit with practical wisdom. Mechanism of legitimacy. The community accepted his role based on his moral authority and the consensus of the signatories. 15. Treatment of those outside the covenant. Non-signatories, tribes, or individuals who did not join the pact were not automatically enemies, but their relationship to Medina was regulated. Hostility toward the city could produce defensive responses from the community. Incentive to join. The protections and economic benefits of membership incentivized communities to agree to the covenant, enlarging Medina's circle of security. 16. Enforcement, penalties, and remedies. Collective enforcement. Violations of the Charter's terms were addressed by communal enforcement. Fines, restitution, or collective sanctions could be imposed. Restorative emphasis. The aim was often to restore peace and compensate victims rather than to exact endless vengeance. Role of negotiation. The Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, and his deputies often used negotiation, arbitration, and compromise as primary enforcement tools. 17. Flexibility and adaptability. The Charter as a living document, not frozen law. While the Constitution laid out core principles, it was applied flexibly to address changing circumstances, such as new tribes joining or new conflicts arising. Practical amendments. Over time, agreements and specific arrangements were adapted through communal decisions and the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, led rulings. The Charter provided a framework, not an exhaustive code. 18. Political and moral principles embodied. Rule of law. The Charter elevated written communal rules above arbitrary tribal reprisals. Mutual responsibility. It emphasized solidarity among diverse groups for common defense and welfare. Religious tolerance in civic life. By protecting religious autonomy, the Charter established tolerance as a civic principle. Justice and mediation. Centralized dispute resolution and a focus on reconciliation were core ethical elements. 19. Immediate effects in Medina. Pacification. It reduced inter-tribal violence and created a predictable political order. Coalition building. The covenant enabled cohesive decisions on defense, trade, and civic administration. Foundation for the Islamic polity. It provided the structural base upon which the early Muslim state consolidated territorial control and governance. 20. Long-term legacy and significance. Model of pluralistic governance. Historians and political theorists often cite the Constitution of Medina as an early example of a social contract that recognized plural identities while creating shared political obligations. Influence on Islamic jurisprudence. The principles of community responsibility, protection of minorities, and centralized arbitration influenced later Islamic governance and legal thought. Contemporary relevance. Modern commentators see its ideas as relevant to religious pluralism, minority rights, and federal or confederal arrangements, particularly the balance of communal autonomy with shared civic duties. 21. Misconceptions and clarifications. Not a purely religious document. While it arose in a religiously charged context, its primary function was political organization and civic governance. Not an absolute equality charter. It protected groups and individuals politically, but did not mandate identical cultural or religious assimilation. Not a single surviving manuscript. What we have are reports and summaries transmitted in early Islamic literature, so exact wording and article count vary among sources. The underlying principles, however, are well attested. 22. Why scholars value it. Historical innovation. It marks a shift from tribal to institutional governance in the Arabian Peninsula. Practical statecraft. The Charter is praised for pragmatic solutions to real problems. Security, justice, and economic stability. Ethical governance. It blends moral guidance with administrative rules, a hallmark of sustainable governance. 23. Conclusion. What the Constitution achieved. The Constitution of Medina was a pioneering political document that transformed a fractious tribal city into a functioning, pluralistic polity. It balanced community autonomy with collective responsibility, instituted central dispute resolution, guaranteed basic protections, and established a pragmatic model of coexistence. Its immediate success in stabilizing Medina and its long-term influence on political thought make it one of the most important founding documents in early Islamic history.